The Balkans, a region rich in history, conflict, and isolation, has always been a land of secrets. Nestled within its rugged landscapes, with mountains that seem to keep the outside world at bay, there existed a small hamlet, a place that never truly belonged to the maps of the world. For years, this village's existence was a mystery, not just to those who lived outside its borders, but even to many within the region. It was a place so isolated, so cut off from modernity, that the world simply forgot about it. But its true identity was hidden even further, distorted on the official maps of the time. Its name wasn't just erased from history, it was actively falsified, buried beneath a veil of secrecy that would take decades to lift. Imagine a place so far removed from the world, so cloistered within its own little world, that it was almost as if it were a relic from another time. A place where whispers of the outside world had long faded, replaced only by the sound of winds sweeping through narrow, crumbling streets. Here, the people lived, married within their own bloodlines, and carried on their traditions without any knowledge of what lay beyond the mountains. The village was its own universe, a universe hidden beneath the shadows of history. It wasn't just the physical barriers that kept this village secret, it was the silence that shrouded it. This wasn't merely a forgotten place, it was one that had been deliberately erased. The mystery begins with the maps themselves. Most people would think of maps as the tools of exploration, the guides to unknown lands. They represent knowledge, a sense of belonging in the world. But in this case, maps became instruments of control, manipulation, and, ultimately, concealment. How could a village exist, and yet not appear on any map? How could a community, living just beyond the mountain's edge, be hidden from the larger world, as if it were intentionally removed from all the records that could have brought it into the light? The answer lies not in geographical mistake, but in something much darker. It wasn't that the hamlet had simply been overlooked by the cartographers or lost in the shuffle of a changing region. No, this village's obscurity was crafted. Its existence was deliberately denied, written out of the maps that chronicled the Balkans' shifting political landscape. At first glance, it seems almost unfathomable. How could an entire community, with its own distinct culture, identity, and people, be left out of the records of the land? The answer lies in the dark history of the Balkans itself, where power, politics, and secrecy often intertwined in ways that shaped entire generations. The hamlet was located in a region known for its historical volatility. The Balkans had long been a crossroads of empires. The Ottoman Turks had ruled for centuries, the Austro-Hungarians came and went, and even after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the region saw its share of conflict. It was the site of countless wars, revolutions, and treaties that redrew borders and changed the course of nations. During these turbulent times, it wasn't uncommon for certain villages or communities to find themselves forgotten or erased in the rush to maintain control. These were places that didn't fit neatly into the shifting boundaries of national identity or geopolitical aspirations. For the villagers, life remained largely unchanged for generations. They didn't concern themselves with the outside world. Theirs was a community that lived in isolation, both physically and culturally, from the rest of the Balkans. They did not know what the outside world had in store, and they did not seem to care. Their days were filled with repetitive tasks, marked by the seasons rather than the passage of time. They carried on their ways, generation after generation, unbothered by the modern world that had begun to sweep through the region. But despite their peaceful existence, there was a dark secret hidden within the very foundation of this community. The first glimpse into the village's disturbing reality comes from the bloodlines themselves. Here, families were closely intertwined, so much so that they began to marry within their own circles, over and over again. These tightly bound bloodlines would later become the key to the hamlet's mysterious fate. The village's world was so confined that they didn't see the dangers of their insular practices. They didn't realize the consequences of generations marrying within the same small pool of families, unknowingly condemning themselves to a cycle of genetic deformities, mental illness, and physical ailments that would plague their descendants for years to come. Yet, there was another layer to the secret, the deliberate attempt to keep them hidden. In the context of a region that had seen its share of political upheaval, these villages were considered undesirable by many who held power in the larger cities. Their existence posed a threat to the prevailing narrative of the region, one of modernization and progress. How could the world move forward when there were places like this, communities that lived in the past, untainted by the advancements of the modern era? These people, left to their own devices, had become a dark anomaly in an otherwise progressive landscape. And so, they were erased, left to fade away into the forgotten corners of history. The false name attached to the hamlet was no accident. It was a statement, a way of keeping the world from discovering what lay beneath the surface. The village, buried under layers of secrecy, became a kind of legend. Whispers would occasionally reach the ears of outsiders, rare travelers, explorers, or the curious few who dared to venture into the mountains. But these whispers always stopped short of clarity. Those who spoke of the village spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to give voice to its existence. Those who came too close often vanished without a trace, adding to the mystery of the place. These were not the types of stories that inspired grand myths or folklore, but the kind that gnawed at the edges of the imagination, creeping into the consciousness of anyone who would listen. The hamlet existed in a kind of historical purgatory, its name erased from the records, its people forgotten. But the truth was buried deeper, beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful lives. What happened in that small, isolated community was not merely a matter of poor geographic placement on a map. It was a deliberate act, a decision made by those in power to keep a certain part of history hidden away. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was shame. But whatever the reason, the hamlet was allowed to fester, to decay, and to multiply its secrets. The question of why this village was erased from history lingers in the mind. Was it a political decision? A measure of control in a land where power was constantly shifting? Or was it something darker, a desire to hide the disturbing realities of what had become of the people who lived there? As the years passed, the village continued to remain a shadow of its former self, untouched by the world outside. It was as if it had been forgotten by design, its story lost to time. But secrets cannot stay hidden forever. And, eventually, the truth of the hamlet's existence began to emerge. It would not be revealed all at once, and it would not be without cost. The road to uncovering the village's story would be long and fraught with challenges, but the answers were there, waiting to be unearthed. The village may have been forgotten by the outside world, but its history, the history of isolation, bloodlines, and hidden communities, would eventually come to light, and with it, a story that was darker than anyone could have imagined. This was no simple mystery. It was a story of neglect, fear, and secrecy, a tale of a community that had been hidden from the world for far too long, and whose existence was tied to something much deeper than anyone could have guessed. The time had come for the forgotten hamlet to reveal its truth. And in doing so, it would not only unearth the dark history of this isolated bloodline but also shine a light on the long-forgotten secrets of the Balkans itself. The Balkans is a region defined by its contrasts. Towering mountain ranges that separate entire communities from one another, vast valleys cradling centuries of history, and an ever-changing political landscape where borders have been drawn and redrawn countless times. This land is rich with stories of empires, revolutions, and wars, places where nations have lived and died, where ancient cultures clash with modern realities, and where the harshness of geography has often shaped the fate of those who lived there. In the midst of this wild, unforgiving terrain, some communities were cut off from the rest of the world, hidden away from the ever-changing tide of history. The village at the center of this story was one such place, buried deep in the mountain passes, forgotten by the world around it. This village, which would later be uncovered as a relic of the past, existed in a geographical isolation so extreme that it became almost impossible to reach. The mountains of the Balkans, rugged, jagged, and difficult to navigate, acted as natural barriers, pushing the villagers to live in ways that the outside world would find nearly unimaginable. To understand the true isolation of this place, you must first understand the landscape in which it resided. The Balkan Mountains stretch like a spine through the region, cutting through countries, cultures, and histories with brutal force. The people who lived in these mountains were not simply isolated by geography, they were also shaped by the natural elements that surrounded them. Dense forests, steep cliffs, and winding rivers kept many villages cut off from the world for months at a time, especially in the winter when snow would blanket the region and turn the paths into treacherous, nearly impassable routes. It was in these conditions that some villages, like the one we are exploring, took root and lived out their existence. These mountainous regions were once ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which stretched across the Balkans for over 4 centuries. During this time, the empire sought to maintain control over the disparate cultures and populations spread across this vast land. Yet, in places like this isolated hamlet, the hold of the empire was weak. These remote villages were left to develop largely on their own, disconnected from the imperial policies and even the changing tides of modernity. The people who lived in these mountain villages often lived in small, tight-knit communities where survival depended on self-sufficiency. Without regular access to trade routes or outside influence, These villages remained largely unchanged, as if frozen in time, far from the bustle of empires or the reach of political change. The Ottoman Empire's decline in the 19th century created another layer of instability in the Balkans. As the empire weakened, nationalist movements began to stir, with various ethnic groups seeking independence and sovereignty. The people of this remote hamlet would have been, at best, distant observers of these larger political movements, unable or unwilling to participate. To them, the external world, the world of politics, wars, and revolutions, was simply too far away. Their lives governed more by the rhythms of nature than by the ideologies that drove the changing world. It was in this atmosphere of political instability and geographical isolation that the village became even more disconnected from the world. The hamlet's very location, tucked away deep in the mountains, meant that it was easily overlooked by outsiders. Even as the world around it changed, the village continued its existence in much the same way it always had. For the people who lived there was little reason to know what lay beyond the next ridge or across the next valley. Life was a simple affair, farming, hunting, and relying on one another. But this isolation also carried with it a deeper, darker consequence. While the outside world advanced, the people of the hamlet remained locked in place, bound by the customs and ways of life that had defined their existence for generations. They had no need to interact with the broader world. They didn't need to look outward because they had everything they needed within their own borders, except, perhaps, for the knowledge that they were slowly becoming trapped by their own isolation. The stark geography of the region created more than just physical barriers. It also shaped the psychological and cultural boundaries of the community. There were few opportunities for outsiders to enter these remote villages, and even fewer who would have had the means or inclination to try. Those who did venture into these areas, whether out of curiosity, exploration, or necessity, were often regarded with suspicion, if not outright hostility. The people of the hamlet viewed themselves as separate from the world, and they had little understanding of the forces at play beyond their mountain stronghold. News from the outside world took months, if not years, to trickle in. This slow pace of communication meant that the villagers were left to their own devices, relying on traditions passed down through the generations, with little to no contact with the modern world. While most of the Balkans had been experiencing dramatic shifts in the 19th century, the village remained largely unaware of the political changes occurring across Europe. The Ottoman Empire had begun to lose its grip on the region, giving rise to nationalist uprisings and the formation of new states. The people in the village, however, remained untouched by these events. Their primary concerns were local: the survival of their families, the harvest, and the safety of their community. Even the larger shifts in the power dynamics of the region seemed distant and irrelevant. This distance from the major historical events of the 19th century allowed the village to develop in ways that seemed out of sync with the rest of the world. The village became not just geographically isolated but culturally insular as well. In a time when the world was slowly modernizing, the people here remained in their own version of the past. They did not participate in the grand social, political, or technological movements that were sweeping through Europe. Instead, they remained frozen in a time long gone, their lives governed by ancient customs that the outside world had long since abandoned. This lack of interaction with the outside world was not just a matter of geography, it was a matter of choice. The people in the village had no need for the outside world. They had no reason to question the world they had built for themselves, even as it became more and more disconnected from the realities of modern society. But the isolation of the village would not last forever. The very mountains that had protected the villagers from the outside world would one day be their undoing. The world beyond the mountains was changing, and as it did, it began to encroach upon this forgotten hamlet. New technologies, new ideas, and new people would eventually make their way into the village. But by the time the world found its way to the hamlet, it was too late. The people who had lived in isolation for so long had already sealed their fate. The isolation of this village, however, wasn't just a matter of geography or political turmoil. It was also a product of the region's history of empires and shifting borders. The Balkans had always been a region marked by its struggles for independence, with one empire after another passing through, leaving behind remnants of their rule. The remnants of these empires shaped the identity of the region, but also fragmented it. For the people living in the mountain villages, these shifts in power meant little. Their identity was not bound by the national borders that were constantly being redrawn. They had no connection to the new countries emerging in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's fall. They were isolated by choice, by geography, and by circumstance, and the world would continue to move on around them, leaving them trapped in their own corner of history. Over time, as the world modernized and the empires of old crumbled, the village's isolation became a kind of historical anomaly, a vestige of a bygone era. But the world was changing, and as it did, the secrets of the village would slowly begin to unravel, revealing not only the extent of its isolation but the darker consequences of living apart from the rest of the world. At first glance, the false name of the village seemed like a mere geographical oversight, an insignificant detail easily explained away by cartographers who were simply unaware of the small, forgotten community nestled deep in the Balkans. But as we dig deeper into the hidden history of this hamlet, the truth becomes undeniable. The false identity of this place was far from a simple mistake. It was an intentional act, a deliberate decision to erase it from the map of history. What made this village so different from all the others? And why did those in power feel the need to conceal it in such a way? To understand the motivations behind this deliberate falsification of the hamlet's name, we must first examine the broader context of the region during the late 19th century. The Balkans were a volatile, often chaotic region in this period, caught in the throes of empire collapse, shifting national identities, and rising tensions. The Ottoman Empire, which had once controlled much of the area, was in its death throes, struggling to hold onto its remaining territories. As the empire weakened, new nation-states began to emerge, each with their own ambitions and conflicts. This political turbulence created a sense of instability in the region, with the larger powers scrambling to assert control over strategic territories. It was within this landscape of political upheaval that the hamlet was born. The community, with its tightly knit families, secluded existence, and remote location, was of little concern to the grand powers vying for control over the Balkans. But what made the village unique, and what likely led to its eventual erasure from official maps, was its position in the heart of a region that was being constantly reshaped by these political forces. In the midst of all the changes, the village's existence became an inconvenient anomaly, something that didn't fit neatly into the emerging national borders. The false name on the maps wasn't just a matter of neglect, it was a conscious decision, one made for the sake of political convenience. The people in power, whether they were local leaders, government officials, or military commanders, likely saw the hamlet as a relic of a bygone era, a community that had no place in the new order being forged in the Balkans. If the village didn't appear on the maps, it couldn't be counted among the settlements of any one nation. It was easier to simply ignore the village, to pretend it didn't exist, than to deal with the complex realities of integrating such a remote, isolated community into the new political landscape. For those in power, the decision to erase the hamlet was a matter of control. The Balkans were a mosaic of different ethnic groups, religious affiliations, and political allegiances, all of whom had competing claims to the land. Nationalism was on the rise, and with it came a push for consolidation of borders and identities. The idea of small, isolated communities that didn't fit into the larger national narrative was seen as a threat to the coherence of these new nation-states. By removing the village from the map, it became easier to ignore it, to disregard its existence, and to treat its people as though they were irrelevant. But this erasure wasn't just about politics, it was about fear. The villagers, living in isolation for so many generations, had become a mystery. They were perceived as strange, even dangerous, by outsiders. Their customs, their way of life, their insular practices, all of these set them apart from the larger societies that were beginning to take shape in the region. The outside world viewed them with suspicion, if not outright disdain. To the bureaucrats, the officials, and the powers that be, this was a community that did not conform to the modern world, a world that was rapidly industrializing, urbanizing, and redefining itself in the wake of centuries of empire rule. The decision to falsify the name of the village was a way to erase the fear that it represented. By denying its existence, those in power could maintain the illusion of order and progress in the Balkans. The village, with its strange customs and isolated bloodlines, was a reminder of a past that no one wanted to acknowledge, let alone confront. In the eyes of the authorities, it was better to keep the village in the shadows, far from the reach of modernization and national unification. Its people, who had lived outside the sphere of influence of the empire and its successor states, were no longer relevant. They didn't belong in the new political structure that was emerging, and so they were simply written out of history. The falsification of the hamlet's name also had a more personal dimension for the people who lived there. They had long been living in the shadow of secrecy, hidden away from the larger world. The erasure of their community from the map symbolized their deeper alienation from the world outside. For generations, these villages had been cut off from the broader historical currents that had shaped the fate of the region. They were forgotten by history, not just by the outside world but by those in power who could have chosen to recognize them. The false name on the map was the ultimate symbol of their erasure. It wasn't just that they were forgotten, it was that they had been deliberately made invisible. The hamlet's residents lived without the knowledge of the outside world. They had no idea that they had been erased from official records, that their village was a blank spot on the map. For them, the world consisted of their families, their fields, and the mountains that surrounded them. They had no need to look beyond the narrow borders of their community, and so the larger political forces that shaped the fate of their homeland had little bearing on their daily lives. The village's name, like everything else about the community, was lost in the mists of time, forgotten by all but the villagers themselves. But to the outside world, the false name on the map was a way to keep the hamlet in a state of limbo. It was not a village that could be counted, acknowledged, or integrated into the emerging national frameworks. It was a place that, as far as the authorities were concerned, did not exist. The false name allowed them to maintain the illusion of order, even as the region was torn apart by war and nationalism. It was a way of keeping the past at bay, of denying the existence of a community that had lived outside the borders of the empire, and later the borders of the new nation-states, for centuries. This deliberate erasure created a psychological barrier, not just between the villagers and the outside world, but between the villagers and their own history. By removing the village's name from the map, those in power sought to make the village's past disappear, to sever the connection between the community and the larger historical narrative of the region. The people of the hamlet were left in a kind of historical void, neither part of the past nor fully connected to the future. They were trapped in a limbo of isolation, denied a place in the broader story of the Balkans. The false name was a lie that persisted for decades, a lie that would only begin to unravel when the world outside the mountains finally started to reach the remote village. But for many years, it was a convenient lie, one that allowed those in power to ignore the inconvenient truths that lay hidden in the heart of the mountains. It was a lie that protected the new national borders, that preserved the illusion of progress, and that allowed the outside world to maintain the belief that everything was in its proper place. But as with all lies, the truth eventually comes to light. The hamlet, though hidden for so long, was not immune to the forces of history. Over time, the people who lived there began to be rediscovered, and their story began to be told. And with it came the revelation of the falsified maps, the false names, and the dark truth of what had been hidden from the world for so long. The erasure of the hamlet's name was no accident. It was a deliberate act of omission, a conscious decision to keep a forgotten corner of the world locked away from the gaze of history. And in the end, it was that very secrecy that would unravel the mysteries of the village, its people, and the dark legacy of isolation and inbreeding that had plagued its bloodlines for generations. The village, cut off from the world by its remote location in the mountains, existed in a self-contained bubble, isolated not only by geography but by time itself. To those who lived there, life was a simple affair. Days stretched into years, and the years blurred into decades without any noticeable changes. The small community, tucked into a narrow valley surrounded by towering peaks, carried on as if the outside world didn't exist. There was no need for it. The villagers, their customs, and their ways of life were unbothered by the fast-changing world beyond the mountain ridges. They were not part of the unfolding national histories or the wars that raged across the Balkans. The rhythms of their lives were dictated by nature, by the seasons, the harvests, and the familial bonds that anchored them to their land. The people in this village, bound by shared history and isolation, lived within a social framework that was both protective and confining. The physical isolation, combined with the absence of any modern infrastructure, meant that the village had its own set of rules, its own customs, and its own understanding of what was important. There were no schools to speak of, no doctors to consult when illness struck, and no markets in which to purchase goods from faraway places. The village was self-sufficient, its survival dependent on what its inhabitants could grow, harvest, and trade amongst themselves. This sense of self-reliance, while admirable, also sealed them off from the rest of the world, creating a microcosm where every action had consequences, and every tradition was intertwined with the fate of the family. The people who lived in this hamlet were primarily farmers, subsistence workers who relied on the land for everything: food, shelter, and livelihood. The small patches of arable land were carved into the steep mountain slopes, forcing them to cultivate crops that could survive in the harsh, rocky soil. Livestock, too, was a crucial part of their existence, and the villagers raised cattle, sheep, and goats, using them for meat, milk, and wool. The rhythm of the seasons dictated the work that needed to be done, from planting in the spring to harvesting in the autumn. It was a hard life, one of constant struggle against the elements. But the people had no choice but to keep going. There was no other place for them to turn, no way to escape the cycle that had been in place for generations. The isolation of the village allowed for certain traditions to persist, some of them strange and incomprehensible to outsiders. Generations of families had lived within the same small area, and as time passed, certain rituals and customs became ingrained in the community's way of life. These traditions were passed down like family heirlooms. Some were ceremonial, others were practical, but all were vital in maintaining the fragile social fabric of the hamlet. The elders held the knowledge of these customs, and their word was law. The younger generation, growing up in this enclosed world, had little reason to question these practices. The world outside was a distant abstraction, a place they had no real connection to, and so their entire lives were focused on the preservation of their way of life, their land, and their bloodlines. The most striking feature of life in the village was the inbreeding that occurred over generations. With no access to outside marriage partners, the villagers were forced to marry within their own families. This practice, though not immediately recognized as harmful, became a central part of the community's survival strategy, or so it seemed to the people living there. As the generations passed, however, the effects of this isolationist practice began to become apparent. Marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, and other close relatives were common, and this led to a gradual weakening of the genetic pool. While it may have seemed like a natural way to preserve the community's bloodline, it had catastrophic long-term effects on the health of the population. The physical symptoms of inbreeding were subtle at first but became more pronounced over time. Children born to these families exhibited a range of genetic disorders and physical deformities that were immediately noticeable to those who lived there. Though they may have been accepted as part of the village's natural order, the presence of these conditions was deeply disturbing. Some children were born with malformed limbs, others with intellectual disabilities that made it difficult for them to participate fully in the community's work. The social structure of the hamlet, with its strong sense of familial duty, meant that these children were cared for, but their presence also served as a constant reminder of the dangers of inbreeding and the consequences of being cut off from the outside world. The social structure of the village was built around these bloodlines, and this made it difficult, if not impossible, for outsiders to enter. Visitors were rare and often met with suspicion, as if the villagers viewed their own isolation as a shield against the changing world. The people didn't speak of their conditions openly, nor did they show any outward signs of embarrassment. In fact, many saw their way of life as something to be proud of, a reflection of their resilience and the strength of their community. The shared isolation bonded the people together, and in this tight-knit society, there was no room for outsiders who might threaten the balance. Those who tried to enter were often turned away, and the village remained an enigma to the world outside, a place that was almost forgotten by history, lost in the mist of time and geography. But the very practices that had kept the villagers safe for so long were now becoming their undoing. The effects of inbreeding, compounded by the genetic defects that arose from generations of isolation, were starting to take their toll on the population. The elderly members of the community could remember a time when life had been different, when the people were healthier, when the bloodlines hadn't been so tightly controlled. They spoke of how things had changed over time, of how the community had gradually lost its vitality, its energy. And yet, despite the signs of decay, the villagers remained unaware of how dire their situation had become. They were living in a world that had changed without them, a world that was leaving them behind. But for them, there was no escape, no way to leave the mountains and seek a better life in the outside world. This was their world, and they had no other choice but to live in it. The village, with its centuries-old bloodlines and close-knit families, had become a place frozen in time. The practices that had once served to protect and preserve the community now kept it locked in a cycle of genetic decline and isolation. The inbreeding, which had seemed like a natural consequence of the village's environment, had led them to a point where their survival was in jeopardy. The ties that bound them together, their shared customs, traditions, and blood, were now the very forces that were pulling them apart. And yet, in the midst of this decline, there was no one to guide them, no outsiders to provide the help or knowledge that might have saved them from their fate. They had lived in their own world for so long that they no longer knew how to interact with the larger one. They were, in many ways, trapped in their own past, unable to escape the consequences of the choices made by their ancestors. What made this isolation even more tragic was the fact that the villagers had been living in a world that was rapidly changing, and yet they remained unaware of the extent to which they were being left behind. The rise of modern nation-states, the spread of industry, and the advent of new technologies had created a world that was increasingly interconnected. The Balkans, which had once been a patchwork of empires and smaller kingdoms, was now a place where borders were being redefined, where old ways of life were being swept away by the tides of progress. But the villagers, living in their remote valley, were untouched by these changes. They were disconnected from the rest of the world, cut off by the very geography that had once protected them. For the younger generation of the village, the reality of their situation was even more difficult to accept. They had inherited a world that was slowly crumbling around them, a world that had no place for them outside the confines of their family's traditions. The outside world, with its promise of opportunity and advancement, was a distant dream, one that seemed as unreachable as the distant cities that lay beyond the mountain peaks. The young people were taught to accept their way of life as normal, even though it was increasingly clear that it was anything but. They were bound by the same isolationist practices that had kept their ancestors alive but now felt more like a curse than a blessing. Life in the village was hard, and it only became harder with each passing generation. As the bloodlines weakened and the physical and mental toll of inbreeding became more apparent, the community began to feel the strain. Families were unable to care for their sick and disabled relatives, and the younger generation, growing up in a world that was passing them by, began to question the life they had inherited. But despite the growing desperation, there was no way to break free from a cycle. The village had been built on isolation, and now it seemed that isolation was its prison. The village, with all its strange customs and ancient bloodlines, was slowly decaying, trapped in a time that had long since moved on. The slow unraveling of the village's mysteries began when curious eyes from the outside world finally breached the barriers that had long kept it isolated. For decades, the villagers had lived in the quiet shadow of the mountains, wrapped in the security of their self-imposed detachment from modernity. But as history outside their borders pressed forward, technology advanced, and communication improved, the world began to take notice of this hidden place. What had once been seen as a curiosity soon became a subject of intense investigation. For the first time, the village that had long been a mere dot on a map, if it was even marked at all, was thrust into the spotlight. This awakening of interest came from a variety of sources, driven by both external curiosity and internal tensions. Researchers, travelers, and anthropologists, eager to understand the complex dynamics of the Balkans and its diverse cultures, began to venture into these forgotten regions. But the village, with its strange practices and its tight-knit bloodlines, presented a challenge that none of these outsiders could have anticipated. When they arrived, the villagers met them with suspicion, cautious of the very strangers who represented the world they had been so determined to keep at bay. In their minds, the villagers were the last of their kind, and the encroachment of outsiders threatened not just their isolation, but their very identity. At first, the visitors found little more than a quiet and seemingly quaint existence. The villagers spoke little of the outside world, focusing instead on their daily routines, tending to their livestock, planting crops, and maintaining their families. The outside world was a distant, abstract concept for them, something that existed beyond the mountains but had no real relevance to their lives. But the longer the visitors stayed, the more they began to realize that there was something unusual about this place. It wasn't just the isolation that set the village apart, it was the very people themselves. They were not like the other inhabitants of the Balkans. The longer outsiders observed, the more they saw how the villagers' way of life clung to traditions that seemed both ancient and bizarre, their practices perpetuated without question through generations of isolation. There were signs, subtle at first, of something darker beneath the surface. The people of the village seemed to live in a world of their own making, a world that had been untouched by the modern advancements that had swept across the rest of Europe. Their customs, their language, and their beliefs had all remained frozen in time. But there was one glaring aspect of their existence that no outsider could ignore: the physical and mental toll that isolation, combined with generations of inbreeding, had wrought on the community. It was difficult to ignore the disabilities, the deformities, and the cognitive impairments that plagued the villagers. Children were born with conditions that were rare, if not unheard of, in the rest of the world. There were those born with physical deformities, clubbed feet, shortened limbs, and other congenital malformations that mark them as different. Others struggled with developmental delays, unable to keep up with the basic tasks required to maintain their daily lives. To the outsiders who came to observe, these abnormalities were startling. For some, the very sight of these physical deformities was a shock. To the villagers, however, these traits were not seen as strange. They had grown accustomed to them, even as they had no clear understanding of why they occurred. It had simply been part of their world, something they had learned to accept without question. The elders in the village spoke of how things had been different in the past, when the people seemed stronger, healthier, more vibrant. But as the years went on, the signs of genetic decline became more and more evident. Yet there was no effort to address it. In fact, the idea that anything could be done to reverse or prevent the cycle seemed foreign to the villagers. It was simply part of the price they had paid for their isolation, their way of life. The outsiders, upon noticing the clear connection between the village's peculiar way of life and its genetic issues, began to dig deeper. Researchers tried to speak to the villagers, to understand how their practices had evolved, and to unravel the mystery of how such a tightly bound community had come to this point. But the villagers were wary of outsiders and, for the most part, resisted attempts to explain or understand their world. What the visitors didn't initially realize was that the villagers had their own ideas of what had caused their condition. The village had long adhered to a belief that their community was cursed, a belief rooted in superstition and fear. They believed that their family lines had been tainted by some ancient misfortune, a curse that had been passed down through the generations. In their eyes, the deformities, the mental disabilities, and the overall decline in health were the consequences of this curse, not a result of their own actions. This belief in a curse, passed down from one generation to the next, served as a form of protection for the villagers. It was easier for them to accept a supernatural explanation for their struggles than to confront the reality that their physical and genetic decline was a result of generations of inbreeding, a practice that had become entrenched within the very fabric of their culture. To suggest that their problems might be caused by their own decisions, that the very bloodlines they held dear were the source of their suffering, was unthinkable. The curse became a convenient scapegoat, an explanation that allowed them to avoid confronting the harsh truth of their situation. The researchers, undeterred by the villagers' resistance, continued to investigate, piecing together the history of the community and its practices. Over time, they began to uncover the extent of the villagers' isolation, learning that for generations, the community had been living in a bubble, cut off not just by the geography of the mountains, but by the deliberate decisions of its ancestors. The practice of marrying within the community, which had once been a pragmatic solution to the scarcity of potential partners, had evolved into a deeply ingrained tradition. The villagers, believing themselves to be guardians of a unique bloodline, had continued this practice without question, unaware of the genetic consequences that it would bring. But as the researchers began to connect the dots, they realized that the problems facing the village were not just physical, they were also social and psychological. The villagers had created a world for themselves that was so insular, so entirely cut off from the larger world, that they had lost all sense of self-awareness. They did not see themselves as outsiders or anomalies. In their minds, their way of life was normal, even admirable. They viewed themselves as a pure, untouched people, living in a way that others had long abandoned. It was this sense of superiority, of living in the past as if they were untouched by the forces of time, that made it difficult for them to accept the reality of their situation. As the villagers' story began to gain attention, external pressures started to mount. News of their condition, their isolation, and their genetic decline reached local governments, human rights organizations, and public health officials. The village became a point of ethical debate. Should outsiders intervene? Was it right to disturb a community that had lived in isolation for so long? Could modern medicine, science, and ethics justify interfering with a way of life that had persisted for centuries? These questions, complex and fraught with moral dilemmas, began to dominate the conversations of those who sought to understand the village. For the villagers, however, intervention seemed unthinkable. They had lived for generations under the illusion that their community was self-sufficient, that their way of life was enough to sustain them. The very idea that someone from the outside world could come in and change anything was not only unwelcome, it was deeply threatening. To accept help, to acknowledge that their way of life was flawed, was to admit that the curse they had long believed in was not supernatural, but real, and that it was self-inflicted. The outsiders, for their part, were caught in an ethical bind. On the one hand, they understood the importance of respecting the villagers' autonomy, their cultural beliefs, and their right to live as they saw fit. On the other hand, it was clear that the villagers' isolation was no longer a choice, it was a prison. The villagers' health was deteriorating, their bloodlines weakening, and their way of life unsustainable. Something needed to change, but the question was, who had the right to make that change? The investigation into the village, its genetic history, and its social structure continued, with outside experts taking a closer look at the ramifications of the community's isolation. But the ultimate question remained, Would the villagers ever be able to break free from their self-imposed prison? Or would they continue to live in the shadow of the curse they had long believed to be the cause of their decline? The answer, in the end, would depend on whether they could reconcile their way of life with the reality of their genetic fate, and whether they were willing to face the truth about the cost of isolation. As the story of the isolated village continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that its survival hinged not just on the geography of its location or the isolation imposed by the surrounding mountains, but also on a deeper, almost existential question. Could the community, with all its generational ties, ancient customs, and deeply ingrained beliefs, ever truly break free from the constraints that had defined their existence for centuries? The people of the village had lived for so long in seclusion, so long in the shadow of their own history, that the notion of change had become foreign to them. The very idea of breaking the cycle of inbreeding, of welcoming outsiders into their lives, was almost too radical to contemplate. But as the outside world continued to press in, as modernity encroached on their isolated existence, the villagers were left with a haunting question. Could they continue as they had for generations, or would they be forced to adapt, to confront the very practices that had kept them in stasis for so long? The villagers' reluctance to embrace change was not just about resistance to the outside world. It was about fear, about the fear of losing their identity. The village had always existed in a state of timelessness, a place where the past, present, and future seemed to blur into one continuous existence. Their traditions were not just customs, they were the very foundation of their existence, the thread that bound each generation to the one before it. To abandon those traditions, to question the way they had always lived, felt like an affront to everything they had ever known. The village, in their minds, was more than just a place. It was a living testament to the endurance of their ancestors, a symbol of their ability to withstand the test of time. Yet, as the physical and social signs of their genetic decline became impossible to ignore, even the most staunch defenders of the village's isolation were forced to confront the reality that their way of life might no longer be sustainable. The long-standing practice of inbreeding had, over generations, created a community where the genetic pool had grown dangerously shallow. The physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, and health problems that had long been a feature of life in the village were no longer simply a quirk of nature. They were symptoms of a deeper, more profound issue, an issue that could not be wished away or explained by superstition. The villagers had, in a sense, become prisoners of their own customs, bound by a cycle they no longer fully understood but were unable to escape. The external forces that began to encroach on the village were not just physical, they were psychological as well. Outsiders, researchers, scientists, doctors, and even tourists began to make their way to the village, bringing with them the tools of modernity, knowledge, medicine, and the promise of a life beyond the mountains. Some of the villagers were curious, intrigued by the idea that there might be a world beyond their familiar boundaries, while others were deeply suspicious, believing that the intervention of outsiders would bring nothing but ruin. In many ways, the arrival of these outsiders was a wake-up call for the community, forcing them to reckon with the extent of their isolation and the impact it had on their health and well-being. For some, the intrusion of the outside world was seen as an inevitable part of progress. The younger generation, in particular, had grown up hearing stories of the broader world, of nations and cities that existed beyond the mountains. They were not as wedded to tradition as their elders and were more open to the idea of change. Many had felt a growing sense of frustration, a desire to break free from the stifling confines of their village life and explore the possibilities that lay beyond. But for the older generation, the notion of leaving the village behind was inconceivable. They had lived their entire lives in the shadow of their ancestors, and the idea of abandoning the community's way of life was tantamount to abandoning their heritage. The conflict between the older and younger generations created an atmosphere of tension in the village. The elders, fiercely protective of their customs and traditions, saw the outside world as a threat to their way of life. They feared that any change, no matter how small, would result in the loss of everything they had fought to preserve. The younger villagers, on the other hand, saw the outsiders as a potential lifeline, a way to break free from the patterns that had held them captive for so long. They were willing to entertain the idea of change, even if it meant confronting the uncomfortable truth about their community's decline. This clash of perspectives created a rift that ran deep through the heart of the village. Some elders dismissed the idea of medical intervention, seeing it as an affront to their way of life. They believed that the village's afflictions were the result of divine punishment or a curse, and that to seek outside help would be to deny the spiritual truths that had guided their community for centuries. For them, the inbreeding, the deformities, and the physical and mental health problems that plagued the younger generations were part of a divine plan that could not be altered or undone. They believed that the village had been chosen to bear this burden, to live as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of hardship. But the younger generation, with its broader view of the world, found it increasingly difficult to accept these explanations. The knowledge they had gained through their interactions with outsiders, stories of advances in medicine, of people living healthier and longer lives, made the village's isolation seem like a tragedy. They began to see the dangers of continuing to marry within the same families, to perpetuate the cycle of genetic decline. For them, it was no longer a matter of cultural preservation but of survival. They understood that without intervention, the village would slowly fade into oblivion, its bloodlines growing weaker with each generation, until there would be nothing left but memories of a time long past. The external pressure was growing, too. As more researchers and medical experts came to the village, they began to document the extent of the village's genetic disorders. Their reports, though respectful of the village's way of life, made it clear that something needed to be done. The village was at a crossroads. The choice, however, was not an easy one. The villagers' sense of pride, their belief in the sanctity of their traditions, and their deep attachment to their land and way of life made the idea of leaving everything behind almost unthinkable. But for the first time in generations, the villagers were forced to confront the stark reality of their situation. If they did not change, their bloodlines would eventually disappear altogether. The very practices that had once kept their community together were now the very things that were unraveling it. For many, the idea of breaking the cycle of inbreeding was anathema. It was not simply a matter of social tradition, it was a matter of identity. To marry outside the village, to allow strangers into their lives, was to invite the possibility of change, of dilution, of contamination. The villagers feared that by accepting outsiders, they would lose their unique sense of self, their connection to the past, and their claim to the land they had inhabited for so long. They saw themselves as a people apart, a community that had survived against all odds, and to let go of that identity felt like losing everything. But as the decades passed, the reality of the village's decline became increasingly undeniable. The younger generation, more open to change, began to see that the price of their community's survival was greater than their attachment to tradition. They began to speak out more boldly, advocating for medical intervention, for education, for the possibility of integration into the broader world. The elders, though resistant, could not deny the truth that was unfolding before their eyes. As the physical toll of inbreeding became more visible, as the health of their community deteriorated, even the most steadfast among them began to question the wisdom of their ways. For the first time in generations, the village stood at a crossroads, caught between the past and the future. The question was no longer whether the village could survive, but how it would choose to move forward. Would it remain locked in the past, clinging to traditions that were slowly but surely destroying it, or would it embrace the possibility of change, of hope, of survival in a world that was moving beyond it? The village's story became a poignant symbol of the struggle between tradition and progress, between isolation and integration. It was a microcosm of the larger struggles facing many communities in the Balkans and beyond, places where the past clings to the present, where ancient customs are both a source of pride and a trap. The village's fate, in the end, would not only depend on its ability to embrace change but on its willingness to confront the uncomfortable truth of its own history. And as the world beyond the mountains watched, the people of the village were left to decide whether they would continue to live in the shadow of their past or whether they would step into the uncertain light of the future. The tension between the villagers and the outside world deepened as the effects of isolation continued to take their toll. There was an unmistakable sense of inevitability in the air, as if the community had come to a crossroads where the choice to continue living as they always had, or to change, was no longer a matter of preference but of survival. The outside world, with its advancements in medicine, technology, and knowledge, had a way of intruding upon the village in ways both subtle and profound. Visitors came from all over, some drawn by curiosity, others by the promise of discovering something untouched, something pristine in its ancient ways. But none of them had been prepared for what they would find. The village was not merely an untouched relic of the past. It was a living, breathing organism struggling under the weight of its own history. It was a place suspended between two worlds, the world that had moved on without it, and the world it clung to for survival. While some of the villagers welcomed these outsiders, curious to hear their stories or see what was happening beyond the mountains, others remained more cautious, even fearful. They saw the arrival of these strangers not as an opportunity for knowledge or progress, but as a threat. Outsiders brought with them ideas that undermined everything the villagers had known. They questioned long-standing traditions and customs, suggesting alternatives that the villagers, perhaps too proud or too fearful, could not immediately accept. The arrival of modernity, represented by these foreign visitors, was perceived by many as an invasion, not only of their territory but of their very identity. The villagers had lived in isolation for so long that their connection to the outside world had been severed. They had no understanding of the broader geopolitical changes that were reshaping the Balkans. Wars had been fought, empires had crumbled, and new borders had been drawn, all of which had left the village untouched, like a relic from a forgotten time. To them, the world beyond the mountain peaks was a distant, almost mythical place, a place that had no bearing on their daily lives, and in return, they had no bearing on it. They had their own ways, their own rules, their own systems. Their sense of self was defined by their insular, tightly knit society, and the idea that they might be part of a larger world, one in which their practices might be questioned, was simply too alien to comprehend. But the more outsiders observed, the more it became clear that something was deeply wrong within the village. The signs of inbreeding, once subtle and dismissed as part of their strange, isolated existence, had become impossible to ignore. It was not just the physical deformities, the cognitive impairments, or the disabilities that were now so prevalent. It was the sense of stagnation, of a community that had become mired in its own isolation, unable or unwilling to break free from the patterns that had governed their lives for centuries. As researchers began to document the genetic history of the villages, the full extent of the damage became evident. The bloodlines, once strong, had now grown dangerously diluted. Diseases that were once rare had become common, and the villagers' bodies seemed to carry the weight of generations of genetic mutations. What had been seen as quirks of nature or divine punishment by the villagers had been revealed as the tragic result of their self-imposed isolation. As the visitors began to see the effects of this insular existence, they started to speak up. Doctors and anthropologists, initially drawn by the allure of studying a people so untouched by modern civilization, became increasingly concerned. The village, they realized, was not merely a cultural oddity, it was a public health crisis waiting to happen. The diseases and genetic disorders plaguing the community were not inevitable. They were the result of a practice, a tradition, that had no place in a world that had moved beyond the confines of small, isolated villages. The longer the village remained in its bubble, the more likely it was that the bloodline would be irreparably damaged. What had once been a necessary survival mechanism, marrying within the family to ensure continuity, had become an unsustainable cycle of genetic decay. The question was no longer whether the village could continue its way of life, but whether it could survive at all. The younger generation, growing up in the shadow of their ancestors' mistakes, found themselves caught between two worlds. On one hand, they had been raised in the village, steeped in its traditions, taught to respect the old ways. On the other hand, they had been exposed to the outside world, even if only through the brief encounters with strangers who ventured into the mountains. They had heard of other places, other people, who lived differently. They had seen glimpses of a world that didn't adhere to the same rules, a world where people married outside their families, where diseases could be cured, and where the bonds of blood weren't the only thing that defined a person. For these young villagers, the outside world was no longer a distant abstraction. It was a place that held the promise of a different future. Some of the younger villagers, those who had grown weary of the stagnation and isolation, began to question the validity of the traditions that had governed their lives for so long. They knew, deep down, that the life they had inherited was unsustainable. But breaking away from the past was no simple matter. The older generation, with its deep attachment to tradition and its fear of outside influence, was resistant to any suggestion of change. To them, the customs of the village were sacred, and to question those customs was to question the very foundation of their identity. The villagers saw themselves as a people set apart from the rest of the world, their uniqueness both their strength and their curse. They believed that by maintaining their way of life, by holding on to the bloodlines that had carried them through generations, they were preserving something valuable, a sense of purity, a connection to the past, to their ancestors. The presence of outsiders in the village forced the elders to reckon with these difficult truths. For some, it was a wake-up call, an opportunity to see their community through fresh eyes, to understand that their way of life was not immune to the consequences of genetic decline. For others, however, it was a source of resistance. The elders, deeply rooted in their beliefs, clung to the idea that their customs were the only way to preserve their heritage. They feared that any external intervention, whether in the form of marriage outside the family or medical assistance, would dilute their bloodline and destroy the very thing they held dear. To them, the idea of change was not just a threat to their way of life, it was an existential threat. It was a threat to their identity, to their place in the world, and to the stories of their ancestors that had been passed down for centuries. As the divide between the older and younger generations deepened, the village itself began to change in ways that were harder to ignore. The physical health of the villagers continued to deteriorate. More children were born with disabilities, more adults were unable to work due to chronic illness, and the community as a whole seemed to be in decline. The strain of living in such a closed system, where bloodlines had been reduced to a few tightly interwoven families, began to show in ways that were impossible to hide. The effects of generations of inbreeding were not just physical, they were psychological as well. The villagers, long cut off from the outside world, had become increasingly insular, wary of anyone who might threaten their way of life. They had developed an intense suspicion of outsiders, viewing them as carriers of change, as forces that would disrupt the fragile balance they had built. In their eyes, the world beyond the mountains was a hostile, unpredictable place, one that had no place for their traditions or their way of life.